Dante is a writer, lawyer, and a career Foreign Service officer who has served extensively in Africa and Asia. He is the author of The Pure Life, a novel, and has contributed opinion pieces to the online editions of Foreign Affairs, National Geographic Voices, and through the Tribune News Service, the Miami Herald, the Tampa Tribune, the Akron Beacon Journal, and Newsday, among others. Prior to his joining the U.S. Department of State, he practiced financial services and bankruptcy law in Boston, and he received his JD from UCLA, and he's also the recipient of the State Department's Heroism Award and Superior Honor Award and the U.S. Army's Superior Civilian Service Award. He makes his home in Portland, and he's come all the way from there. So please, without further ado, give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. It's great to see all of you here. I really appreciate it. I got a story for you. It's been a long time in the making. I have to say a few words of thanks to a couple folks. Thanks, Brian, for the introduction. I really want to thank Sebastian Younger. He's a friend of mine. I helped evacuate him from Liberia, so we're going to talk a little bit about that experience. And he's been gracious enough to let us do a little bit of a reading for you tonight. So I really appreciate that. I also want to thank my agent, Tony Othwaite, who was one of the early believers in this story. I think anybody who works does creative endeavors knows how hard it is to bring things to the public, and it starts with people who believe in the story. And Tony was there. Also, my editor, Megan Trank, over there. She's the one who said, "Hey, our company is going to take this one on, right? Our publishing house is going to take this one on." And so, without that, we wouldn't be here. I also want to thank my mom over in the corner. It's great to have her out. Yeah. And my aunt and uncle are there, so it's thanks, Mom. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for her, for sure. and a couple other people. The Mushers played a really important role in my life. Dr. David Musher and Ruth Musher. They're really, like a second family to me, and I'm just so honored to have them here. And then there's a couple other people. Many of you I know, many of you I care deeply about. I really thank you for coming. So I can't really go down everybody by name, but what I would like to do is just point out a couple other folks who were on the ground in Liberia with me at various stages. The first one is Ben Feibelman over here. He's a Marine security. He was a Marine security guard who kept the embassy safe at a really critical time in Liberian history. It was right after we had sort of brokered a rough peace on the ground in the capital city, but they had to expand the peace throughout the countryside, and there were periodic flare-ups of violence. And so when you have guys like Ben, on the roof or at Post 1 guarding us, we're able to get the diplomacy done. And without him, we can't get it done. A couple other people I want to recognize. Celia de la Varenne. She has worked on gender-based violence issues with the UN extensively for her whole career. And I met her in Liberia when she was working on the UN mission, really trying to make a difference there. Declan Walsh is a New York Times reporter extraordinaire. He's the Cairo bureau chief right now of the New York Times. He was also there on the ground in Liberia. And I thought long and hard about the excerpt I was going to read to you tonight. I thought that I would maybe embarrass Declan and read about him going across the front lines in the war, but I encourage you to get the book and read about his exploits, because I decided to choose an excerpt of the ambassador going across the front lines. And then Bindi Patel over here in the corner took my job from me when I left Liberia. So, and this is by design. She's a Foreign Service officer also. She's been in some tough places and did really, really important work in stabilizing Liberia at the time. And then we have other journalists here that have helped me along the way tell the story of Liberia. and also tell stories in places that I've been, like Afghanistan. So again, I'm not going to name everybody, but the last person is Ambassador Pernilla Cardell. She's over here. She's the current UN Special Envoy to Afghanistan. And, I've been over in Afghanistan. It's a tough problem set over there. So to have people that are traveling back and forth and trying to do this work is critically important. And so I just want to thank her for making the time to come today. But really, I have so many dear friends here. I just want to say thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to give you a very short introduction to the scene that I'm going to read. Then I'm going to read it, and then I'll take any questions you have. So I appreciate your time and attention. So the story of this book has been a while in the making. It takes place in a very narrow time frame, which is June to August 2003 in Liberia. And this was the inflection point where either the Liberian state was going to dissolve, and that was it. Liberia was going to be finished as a state, and it would look more like Somalia, and people had started to call it maybe Somalia West. Or they could get to rough stability. And the answer was completely in doubt. Charles Taylor was one of the most feared warlords in Africa. He was famous for supporting militia, paramilitary units, and other rebel forces in other countries that did some of the worst crimes that you can imagine. The types of things that you see coming out of ISIS today, they were being done in Liberia and neighboring Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. And just to give you a sense of how serious this was, they would go into rebels that he supported in Sierra Leone would go in to villages and hack off the arms of children and throw them in a big pile and then leave. And they even named the cuts. They would have short sleeve if they cut you up here because it looked like you had a short sleeve shirt, or long sleeve if they took you at the wrist because it looked like you had a long sleeve shirt on. So you had Charles Taylor running Liberia, and you had two rebel armies that were marching to depose him. There's a lot more history as to how this came about, but at the time, in June 2003, Taylor felt that he started to lose the war a little bit. He was losing territory rapidly to two rebel armies. Now, the rebel armies didn't have governing mandates. They came from very specific ethnic groups, and they had very specific funding and very specific objectives, which was revenge. And so, if either of those groups had won, then they wouldn't have a mandate to govern. You'd have essentially a perpetual civil war. A special court came up and they had a sealed indictment against Charles Taylor. So nobody knew what was going to happen. Everybody suspected that Charles Taylor was going to be indicted for war crimes, for crimes committed not in Liberia but in Sierra Leone. And so people didn't know, and there was a rumor. And they held peace talks, finally, in Accra at the beginning of June. And the day that the peace talks started, the indictment was unsealed. And Charles Taylor was at the peace talks. And so everybody in Monrovia went crazy because they said, oh my God, the head of state has been arrested and is going to disappear, and we're left with just Charles Taylor's forces on the ground to basically massacre us because they don't have their leader and they don't really have an objective and they're scared. So, long story short, the rebels attacked the capital. They sensed weakness, they attacked the capital. At the embassy, we evacuated a whole bunch of people, and then we dug in. And there was a big battle as to whether or not to pull the embassy. The ambassador was under tremendous pressure because the Defense Department, and I don't mean the military, but the Defense Department wanted to close the embassy, and they said, we're basically done with Liberia. You've evacuated people, but now it's time to evacuate the embassy as a whole. The main effort was in Iraq, and that's what people wanted to focus on, and they really didn't want to have a repeat of Somalia, which had come a little over 10 years earlier, and they were concerned about that, and so they said, we don't want to see U.S. troops dragged through the streets, and again, Iraq was just starting to heat up again after the overthrow of Saddam. So it's a lot of pressure. The ambassador did not close the embassy. A lot of that story is in the book. This is exactly what the book is about, that those decisions, what it's like when the attack comes. But you needed a way forward. If you're going to stay in a conflict zone, you need a way forward. You need some goal and objective. And what the ambassador knew was that if we could get an intervention force in and separate the warring parties, it would give space for peace. And then the peace talks could yield an agreement. If you could get Charles Taylor out of power, then the peace talks would come. Well, the rebels attacked 3 times. The 3rd time, they were rooted in the city. And the city was a little bit like New York, where there's a big island called Bushrod Island. And in Bushrod Island, all the fuel, all the food that came through the country came through that area. And you had a humanitarian crisis. You had 200,000 displaced people in the city. But the city hadn't had fuel or water or electricity for 10 years. So you already have 1 million people living in really horrendous conditions and another 200,000 people packed in there. Then the rebels split the city. They took half of it, they took this island, and there were 2 bridges connecting the city to this island. And the rebels had the island, Taylor's people had the peninsula. And there was this standoff. And they were mortaring everybody and shooting all the time. And the only people that could get hit were civilians. Fighters would run to the front lines, they would shoot, all those stray bullets would come and just wipe out civilians. A good friend of mine had a line. She said, there was really no place that a mortar could land in Monrovia at that time and not hit somebody. And after a while, there became a rough stasis in the war. And it became clear that we needed to have some peacekeepers come. And if we could get the peacekeepers come, they would have to deploy into a city that's split. And that's basically impractical. And the peacekeepers that were on their way were Nigerian forces. And the Nigerian forces had deployed in the past, and they had been dragged into the conflict, and they'd been a 4th faction. So the ambassador was quite worried that that would happen. And the Nigerians were worried that that would happen. So when things settled a little bit at the front lines, journalists like Declan decided it's a good idea to cross the front lines and find out what's going on the other side. So he crosses the front lines. A couple other people, his colleague Somini at the New York Times also crossed. There were about 10 people who crossed. And a few really brave relief organizations like MSF, the ICRC. There were very few folks in the country to do this, Liberians and international counterparts, and they also crossed the front lines by basically negotiating on the fly with the rebels and with the government to go across these lines where the kids are, basically completely undisciplined, firing at will, and scared, and on drugs. So that's what you're sort of putting your life in their hands. But after they did that, I was talking to people like Declan and saying, okay, this is doable. This is doable. And the ambassador said, you know what? When the Nigerian force commander comes to survey the situation, what we're going to do is we're going to bring him across the front lines to negotiate face-to-face with the rebels and tell them, you got to leave the city so peacekeepers can deploy. Peacefully leave the city that you have conquered and deploy. And the passage I'm now going to read to you is the first time that the ambassador went across the front lines in a small convoy, and he had with him General Okonkwo, who was the Nigerian force commander, and a couple key people like Robert Ferguson, who was our operations coordinator. He works in the Office of the Defense Attaché, which is a military plug in the embassy, and Colonel Suan Sandusky, who was our defense attaché, and a few others, our security officers, and we had some Marines in the convoy. But you're crossing where you don't know if Charles Taylor's folks are going to take shots at you, and you don't know if any of the Lord fighters, the army that we were going to talk to was called the Lord, L-U-R-D. And so it's a very tense situation. It's maybe a day or two of stasis on the front lines, and the ambassador was on his way to try to put the idea into the minds of the rebels that peace was sort of on its way. Okay. They're driving from lower Manhattan up to the middle of Manhattan. That's how you can think of it, right? And they just crossed 2 bridges with the government kind of backing off and finally allowing, and the shooting didn't start. So as they hit Bushrod Island, Fergie, who's driving, did a double take. The entire press corps was staged there, standing in rebel-held territory amid the rubble, barbed wire, and the splintered wood of the checkpoints. Cameras rolled. The journalists towered above the child soldiers like school teachers. There was no sign of any rebel command and control. As far as Fergie could tell, the child soldiers on Bushrod Island were indistinguishable from the child soldiers back across the river. Some of them shouted and ululated. The whole thing he thought was fucking stupid. Vytown, the southernmost neighborhood on the island, bore the brunt of the crossfire throughout the siege. The business district was unrecognizable. All the buildings were shot up. Like a construction site after a wrecking ball, the pavement was cluttered with barbed wire, splintered planks, and blasted chunks of concrete. The rust-colored ribs of rebar jutting skyward like bones in the strata after a massive slide. Blackened apartments gutted by fire had melted on their foundations into charcoal pools. Sheet metal billboards, once bright with crudely painted advertisements, were now so punctured with bullet holes they looked like enormous cheese graters turned on their sides. A mangled lime green bus tilted in a ditch on the shoulder of the road, its frame so shredded with gunshots it assumed the lace-like aspect of a bug-eaten leaf. Fighters in blanched yellow and brown T-shirts glared at them. The rebel assault rifles looked newer than anything Charles Taylor's militia had, the wooden butts dark and shiny as polished chestnut. Rebel graffiti was scrawled everywhere in black spray paint on walls and steel curtains. No monkey. Peering through the windshield in a trailing car, Lieutenant Colonel John Del Coliano thought he had never seen a place shut up like that. Even in Baghdad, roughed up as it was, it seemed to him to have fared better by comparison, except for the places the J-dams hit. He had confidence in the ambassador and his ability to assess the situation, and if John Blaney put himself out there, unarmed, then the Marines would be there with him. But he gained a whole new respect for the diplomatic process. You could not pay a guy enough to go through the front lines like that. Look, Colonel Sandusky pointed. Dragon Master. A lithe young man, still growing into his frame, appeared off to the right and waved at them as he talked to the colonel on his mobile phone. Dragon Master had the smooth skin of someone who could not yet grow a beard, and he wore aviator glasses and a bandana. He carried an assault rifle with a pistol strapped to his side, and as CD-58 approached, he motioned to Fergie to follow his pickup, a looted four-wheel drive with hand-painted camouflage. Fergie fell in behind him, followed by the other embassy cars, then the battle wagons and a scramble of the press. They drove north, away from the front, along the wide central boulevard, hydroplaning through curbside pools the color of chocolate milk. He had no idea where they were headed. The ambassador gazed out at the people in the alleys and side streets, gawking at the convoy packed with uniformed military, and at the rear, the largely unwashed Fourth Estate. To his mind, the residents of Bushrod Island looked astonished. For all he knew, they might have thought the U.S. ambassador had been captured. Along the road, they passed the ragdoll shapes of men and women who had clearly been executed. Stripped naked, their hands knotted behind their backs with electric cable. The bodies were bloated, the flesh in places yellow, purple, and orange, and flaking off. And parts of the faces seemed to have spilled into the gutters. In other places, white skulls and ribs were strewn about in the mud, as though fresh graves had been unearthed. General Okonkwo, seated next to the ambassador, was disgusted. Bodies were everywhere, and nobody cared. It was something he thought that was discouraging for everybody. The rebels looked at those bodies every day and just passed. There were even bodies in the water. He saw the swollen bodies, the way people were living near them, and nobody cared. The rebels, he grimaced, just sat around and ate their food, and it didn't even bother them. Some of the fighters wore whiteface or dresses and strange outfits of wigs and chiffon and spikes and chains, but he'd seen it all during his previous deployment and wasn't bothered by the outlandish dress. His head swayed slowly in disapproval. He simply could not shake the thought of the unburied dead. If human beings can leave bodies that way and eat around them, then anything can happen. You have to be careful. These are not correct people. So the past intrudes on the thoughts at the oddest times. And as the ambassador mulled how to approach Cobra, he found himself thinking about spacing. His step-grandfather, K.A. Luke, had been famous in the old Hollywood studio system as the go-to actor for Chinese character parts. In the 70s, he took a role as the blind master Po, and even invited young John Blaney to the set. It was a surreal place. A set for Camelot hung in the ropes in the dark of the rafters, just above the range of the cameras. Well, Ambassador Blaney, when he was young, he helped Luke put on these white contact lenses with pinholes. And a couple of times his step-grandfather had him stand in for David Carradine, the star, as he practiced the lines. "Grasshopper, take this stone from my hand." And that sort of thing. He was known as One-Take Luke for his perfect recall. So it was not for memorization, but rather so he could practice the distance and spacing between the characters, because he couldn't see. It didn't help that the studio blew dry ice across the set to make it spooky, or that Carradine's large dog Buffalo ran wild on the set and knocked Luke off balance once in a while. How close, the ambassador wondered, is too close when you're talking to a rebel? And how far is too far? Well, the convoy stopped at the gates of the Freeport. A man waved to them under the archway. His mouth was drawn taut, and in a tense scowl, clamped tight in anger, as if to let you know he was someone you wouldn't want to cross. He wore a red beret and a gold leaf insignia, aviator sunglasses, and a thick black beard that added necessary heft to his sunken cheeks. A billowing camouflage jacket, white t-shirt visible at the collar, added to the impression that he had killed men, or ordered them killed. Well, 4 or 5 young men at his side, rifles drawn, looked willing to do whatever he ordered. And it was then that the ambassador knew that before them stood Lord Acting Chief of Defense Staff, Aliyah Sayah Sharif, also known as General Cobra, the architect of the siege. Cobra had words with Dragon Master. He was almost yelling. It was all, the ambassador admitted, a little chaotic. Dozens of fighters lurked in the lots visible through the arches and in shanties across the street. The rebels didn't lack for grenade launchers. The ambassador took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. General Okonkwo right behind him. "Hello," he said, hand extended. "I'm Ambassador John Blaney. I'm glad to meet you." Cobra returned a limp, clammy handshake. He didn't look too well, thought the ambassador. The ambassador said that they had come to speak with the rebels and hear their views, just as they said they would. And he quickly introduced General Okonkwo. His respect for his Nigerian counterpart grew by the second. The general placed himself completely at risk. It was not lost on anyone that Nigerian troops had been killed when they last tried to take the port. And nor did anyone forget that a similar meeting 13 years ago ended in the murder of the Liberian president. The place had some sordid history. Of course, General Okonkwo and his men were armed, and they had U.S. Marines with them, but it would have made little difference. If the rebels attacked, there would have been no good outcome. Well, the press corps caught up and clambered forward, forcing the principals into an ever-constricting circle, so the ambassador was almost shoulder to shoulder with the rebel commander. He didn't like the spacing at all. Jostled from left and right, the noise of the skies and street clouding their ears, it would be impossible to convey the tone and tenor of his messages, let alone the messages himself. Standing there at the gate. "Can we go somewhere to talk?" he asked. Cobra grunted. Then they were back in the convoy, hurtling up the wide, empty central artery of Bushrod. Burnt and shut up cars lined the route. Here and there, long-abandoned pump stations. At long-abandoned pump stations, gas was for sale in plastic bags that hung like intravenous drips from handmade metal coat racks on the islands where the pumps once stood. War is most often associated with entropy, with disorder and destruction, but in some ways it preserves. On the left-hand side, a tall earthen embankment ran on for a mile or so, and over the grassy ridge of which could be seen the white petroleum depots and the gray conical hills of pelletized iron ore that never made it onto the last ships before the miners went bust. As they neared the Bong Mine Bridge, midway up the islands, the rebels veered into a walled compound with a split-level office building and enough space for a fair number of cars to park out front. Cape Maritime Agency, read the sign out front. Now, a gallery of children, most of them toting guns, gawked at the cars from a strip of grass by the cinder block wall. One child was shorter than his rifle, and he dragged the muzzle as kids might pull a red wagon. Scabs of dry mud covered his cheeks, and he wore frayed hide tops and an oversized t-shirt that hung below his knees. Passive, unblinking eyes took in the arrival of the Americans as if they were watching television on mute, entranced by the shifting images, but impervious to the heaving engine, shouts, banging doors, and the sound of gunfire that could be heard off and on beyond the walls. There was the urge to reach out to the children and take away the guns, but no sooner did the ambassador and General Okonkwo step out of the cars than they were ushered by the older fighters into a dark entrance hall of semi-opaque glass, tiled like a public restroom, and up a musty dog-leg staircase. Well, Fergie found himself outside with Robert, the ambassador's driver, and the cars. What the fuck, he thought, as he looked at the children with guns looking at him. Holy shit. Moses Blah once said that children make good soldiers because they're easy to control. But to wage war successfully takes sustained effort. And if the mind of a child could be defined by one characteristic, it would be a tendency toward distraction. Two of the kids set their Kalashnikovs casually against the chain-link fence and started to play tag. They were no more than 9 or 10 years old. They played for a time, shrieking and squealing, oblivious to everything around them. And when they tired, they picked up their rifles and walked away. My God, Fergie thought, these are really just kids. Nearby, another child hugged his assault rifle tight to his chest in one hand, and with his free hand, he held a plastic wiffle ball gun. It wasn't clear that he knew the difference. Inside, the ambassador and General Okonkwo followed the rebels up a dog-leg staircase to the corner office on the second floor. The office appeared seldom used. Dark, sweating, wood-paneled walls were bare, save the water-stained map of Denmark in a simple frame. The upholstery was sandy and abrasive to the touch, staples poking through the dormitory furniture. The ambassador and General Okonkwo squeezed their way through the crush of reporters and photographers to find General Cobra already seated behind a wooden desk, bare save an elephant carved from rosewood, a porcelain figure of a bucking bronco, and an abacus. The ambassador reintroduced himself. Cobra made a few tough remarks about Charles Taylor, how he had to leave the country. Cameras filmed, flashes bounced off the ceiling, and then the rebel bodyguards muscled the reporters out. Rusted hinges and brittle plywood squeaked as the door slammed shut. Backlit by rainlight filtering through a single grated window, Dragon Master and a gaggle of other field commanders stood behind General Cobra. Even with the reporters gone, the dank, stuffy room left little space for the strapping Nigerian soldiers, the Marines, and all the rebels. The ambassador and General Okonkwo were ushered to simple wooden chairs. When everyone was settled, the rebels circulated cans of stale Pringles. Coca-Cola was also offered. Colonel Taiwea smiled. It meant the rebels had looted the port. Most of the team didn't eat the chips, but the gesture, he thought, showed a lot of goodwill. Now, in negotiation of any type, it's critical to know with whom you're dealing. And as the ambassador sat on the hard, small seat and looked hard across at Cobra, it occurred to him that he knew next to nothing about any of the rebels. In the State Department, staffers provided paper to senior officials before they met someone important. Paper generally meant talking points and biographical information. The ambassador didn't like it. because he knew his brief and he didn't like make work. But in this case, biographies would have been helpful. But even if they had anything in the files on the likes of Cobra, it would have been burned long ago. Cobra and his men, who stood behind him, were until that moment marginal in Liberian history. They were Mandingo. They were Muslim. They came from the border areas, and as a class of people, they had been left out of Liberian governance from the start. Nobody knew their names, and that was the point. Well, General Cobra had fought Charles Taylor as a member of one of the old factions that dominated conflict in the 90s. He had long ago served in the armed forces of Liberia, which meant he may have had American training along the way. And at no time before was he considered a senior leader, the type that made it into history books. But whatever his past, the fighters under his command held half the capital and at least half the countryside. He dictated the fate of the city and maybe the country. An uncomfortable silence ensued, which the ambassador mercifully ended by reintroducing himself and General Okonkwo a third time. Discussion, such as it was, centered on the ambassador's proposal that the rebels withdraw from Bushrod Island to the Po River. The ambassador stressed that now that Echo Mill had come to Liberia, Cobra and his men could turn the free port over to them, confident that Charles Taylor would not claim it after the rebels left town. The rebel commander looked irritated but said nothing. The ambassador added that the Lord Chairman had signed a ceasefire agreement, and he noted that he understood that the rebels wanted peace. It all seemed too much for Cobra. "You negotiate with me," he yelled, slamming his fist on the table and knocking the figurines to the floor. "Only me. I take orders. I don't take orders from Sekou Kone. I command the army. I'm going to take Monrovia, and Taylor men will pay in blood for what they've done. In blood. We have the tactics. We have the men. And nobody can come and save them. We will control the city, and I will make the decisions." Cobra turned to General Okonkwo. "I already know this man," he sneered. It was meant as an insult. General Okonkwo rose up from his seat to full height and approached the desk. General Cobra circled around the two men and stood chest to chest. The two men stood chest to chest, trash-talking in mutually unintelligible dialects. It was clear that they had met in Okonkwo's previous deployment in Liberia, and equally clear that the memories were not fond. The Nigerian commander towered over the smaller, thinner rebel, but he was easily outgunned. Sweat slid down foreheads and temples, eyes narrowed, and throughout the room, fingers crept onto triggers. Seconds ticked away. The ambassador jumped up and separated the two men with his hands. "Look," he said to Cobra and his men, his voice dry and one note from breaking. "I'm here to represent American people to the people of Liberia, not just one side. You know, I'm here for everyone. So that means I'm your ambassador too." General Okonkwo finally stepped back. He was not going to let the rebel commander disrespect him. But anyway, he thought, he had already done what he had come to do. Echo Mill made its intentions known to the rebels right on the first day. The objective was to open up the port and move Lord back to the Po River. That was what was mentioned to them, and they never said no. But, he took note, General Cobra kept his options open. I'm going to skip to one last paragraph. They make it back to the embassy, and the ambassador gets a call. The call came from Secretary of State Colin Powell, after the ambassador was already back in the office. The secretary noted that the ambassador had not run the traps with Washington before crossing into no man's land. The ambassador conceded the point, but the secretary let it go and listened intently to his brief. After a few minutes, the ambassador thought he heard a smile through the phone, and the secretary gave him what was, in all likelihood, one of the mildest rebukes in diplomatic history. "It was great, John, but I sure wouldn't try that again." Okay. I hope that's whet your appetite for... I hope that's whet your appetite for this book. I hope you'll give it a good read. I hope you will, share news about it